as being unreliable because he had pro-Axis sympathies, and Iran had a lot of oil which Britain could not afford to do that. Post-World War II is a history of secular reformers opposed by the clerical establishments. The secular national fronts government was formed, led by a man called Mohammad Mossadegh, and he sacked the Shah and nationalised Anglo-Iranian, but that was a bad move. He was toppled by an army coup overseen by the CIA and the Brits. The monarchy was restored, and the kindest thing that can be said about Mohammad Reza, the last Pahlavi to rule in Iran, is that he was a man of little ability. It's a flaw that's inherent in dynasties, of course. The inheritance principle means that you can end up with a duffer. He had everything going for him, of course. He had the support of the West, Great Britain and the USA, massive oil revenues, a 400,000-man army, a very large and effective police force, and an extremely vicious secret police service known as the Sabak. However, the forced modernization policies his government pursued alienated everybody, from the peasants, the clerics, the big industrialists, and the emerging urban middle class. In January 1978, there was a student demonstration, riots, followed by repression, martial law, shooting on demonstrators, hundreds were killed. It's the usual sad litany of what happens when people go up against, unarmed people go up against an armed state. And the vacillating Shah was given contradictory advice by the USA, and he wasn't particularly lucky. He was struck down by cancer, and he went abroad for his own health. In October 1978, a leading opposition cleric, a man by the name of Khomeini, whom I suppose you've all heard of, he was expelled and moved to France. But even before the internet, he had the facilities of fax and Xerox, was able to carry out opposition propaganda from the comforts of his Paris flat. Anyway, he returned, and the Shah, who was by now very sick indeed, left the country in January '79 to be replaced by Ayatollah Khomeini. And this was more than the usual violent regime change. This was, I like to argue, in fact a revolution. The whole structure of state authority collapsed. The police, the courts, and the resulting political vacuum was filled by militant clerics and students on the make. Mass killings of opponents, estimated as many as 10,000 were eliminated. And in 1980, a new constitution for an Islamic State was proclaimed, but in fact it behaved just like any other repressive organisation, as I've just described. And in the last 10 minutes, I'd like to consider what happens when Islamists take power. How many of those witnessing the 1979 revolution that overthrew the Shah of Iran are struck now by how little it has achieved, I wonder. It's very much a case of revolutionary success and social failure. This was the first Islamic takeover, the most promising in fact, that an old established civilization and a resource-rich base, and the most successful Islamist regime, in fact the only one still in power, had a lot going for it. Yet 25 years after, the massive, joyous, hope-filled crowds fill the streets, not only have bedrock principles and sacred promises, strictly Islamic government, for example, and an end to dictatorship, they've all fallen by the wayside, and some conditions that led to the Shah's downfall, for example, corruption and political repression, have reportedly got worse under the others. Finally, let's have a look at what was promised and what actually happened. There are lessons here for all of us, I think. The promise before the revolution. Islamic clerics would help lead the revolution, but then step aside and let others rule. This is what Khomeini said, I quote, "The religious dignitaries do not want to rule." That's what he said in October '78 when he was in exile. After he gained power in Iran, this is what he said: "Those who pretend that religious dignitaries should not rule poison the atmosphere and combat against Iran's interests." Criticism of Islamic government would be tolerated, as promised. Quote, "The Islamic government will answer criticism by reason and logic." That's what he said before he came back. On his return, he was quoted as saying, "I repeat for the last time, abstain from holding meetings, from blathering, from publishing protests, otherwise I will break your teeth." And he was serious about it. Okay, as a final summary, a little dialectic summary, what have we seen? We've seen globalization met with resistance, imposition met by rejection. What we now have is a global jihad which takes the struggle for Islamicist ideas to the enemy in new and unsuspected ways. The dates 9/11 and 7/7, suicide bombings, death and murder, are only too familiar to us all. The new Islamists seek not to reform existing regimes, but to eliminate them. In doing this, they claim to be doing God's work. I have a question. If God is all-powerful, why does he not do his own dirty work?
I think it's tempting to look back at the history of the Islamic religion in order to try and sort of seek reasons for why it takes the form it does today. You didn't in fact do that. You focused on what was happening today, and I think that was the right thing to do, because I think what